Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 15. That's sure to win over a few hearts and minds. Early the next morning, Lieutenant Thorne got up, nodded kindly to the guards he always ignored, and jogged to the fort well before Professor Slither would start to pull himself from bed. Bounding through the gates, he headed to his old barracks and the sergeant's command building. He knocked lightly on the open door to get Sergeant Onus's attention. Thorne, to what do I owe this visit? Sergeant, the lieutenant said in a low voice, you said once that if I ever needed anything, I could... He hesitated, but Onus gave him a welcoming smile. Of course. Come in, sit down. What do you need? The lieutenant sat in a chair across from his desk and massaged his hands. I think I'm messing up, but I don't know how. I've heard that soldiers don't care for me, and the villagers don't like me either. It's even been suggested that some of them are trying to get rid of me. He looked at his former sergeant with pleading in his eyes. Onus nodded slowly. Not so great up there at the mansion, is it? Don't know who to trust, don't know who's watching you. I can only imagine. But I'm not sure how I can help. The lieutenant leaned forward. Help me find a way to win their trust, to get the soldiers and the villagers to like me or something. What can I do? We've started some of the entertainments again, but I don't know what else. The general would have suggestions, I'm sure, but it's not like I can write him about this. What about Slither? Onus asked. He might have some suggestions on improving your leadership skills. The lieutenant rolled his eyes. I don't think he knows what he's talking about. He's so old, you know. Sergeant, you can help me think of something, can't you? What do the people really want? What do the soldiers want? Onus sat back and pursed his mouth. I know of something they really want, but it's not easy to provide. What? What is it? More food, Lieutenant, Onus said. If their stomachs are grumbling, people won't be happy, no matter how peaceful the world is or how entertained they are. The lieutenant sagged. Oh, there's simply not enough. The food shops that are still operating are on rationing and charging up to 100 times as much as they used to. A loaf of bread is going for the price of a used saddle, Onus told him. Really? And a jug of mead is worth an entire silk wardrobe. You don't know this, Onus said, because Twig and Thorn don't want you out in the village too much. Slither mentioned that, the lieutenant sighed. I didn't know, I really didn't. I'm going to put the mansion on rations too. Slither won't be happy about that, but we need to set the example. The supplies in the south are relatively sound, the general wrote me. Onus leaned forward. Anything from there would take at least another week to arrive, probably longer. You need a solution faster than that. And I have an idea. Find out the status of the storehouses in Edge and the fort, and reconfigure your estimates to give everyone larger rations. Then send a message to General Thorne requesting additional supplies and maybe a larger variety. You can treat the people to extra food beginning tonight, if you get it all figured out, and then promise them more supplies in 2 weeks. For the first time, the lieutenant began to feel hopeful. Yes, that's good. If the storehouses are in better shape than we assumed, then we can begin feeding people today. That's sure to win over a few hearts and minds. Thank you, Sergeant, for everything. I'll start inspections immediately. Onus smiled as if it were nothing. I recommend going to the southern storehouse first, then move north. Then check the status of the fort. Maybe do spot inspections. You can always come back here if you need some help with the inventory. I feel like I know the procedures as well as you do now. The lieutenant leaped to his feet and reached across the desk to shake the sergeant's hand. Thank you, Sergeant. Onus grinned as the lieutenant pumped his arm. Any time, Leg. Anytime. He chuckled as the lieutenant bounded out of his office and out the building. A moment later, Onus pulled out a scrap of paper and jotted down a few words. "Private," he called out to the hallway. A soldier stepped in. "Take this to Captain Varus immediately. Tell him I'm in my office if he has any questions." The soldier took the folded scrap and jogged out of the office. Onus sighed. Sorry, little lieutenant, but how can I resist when you hand it to me on a golden platter?" The lieutenant retrieved Trigger from the stables, knowing Major Twig would lecture him again about putting himself in risky situations. So that's why he didn't bother checking in with him first, and he rode south to the first of the 2 emergency storehouses in Edge. He knew all about the status of the fort storehouses, but he'd never checked the village's supplies. Supposedly, the neighborhoods were to keep their storehouses supplied and report their doings to Major Croup, but the lieutenant knew that anything given to Croup was lost in a pit of pages. When he arrived at the storehouse, he knew things wouldn't be good. If there was anything in there, someone from the neighborhood should have been guarding it, but no one was. He dismounted, walked up to the doors, and threw them open. Nothing. Are you really surprised? The unexpected word spun him around. He immediately unsheathed his sword and faced the voice behind him. The small old man raised his eyebrows at the shining blade. "Would I be standing here if I was the one who'd emptied the storehouse?" he asked conversationally. "Where's the food?" The lieutenant's voice was more panicked than he wanted it to be. "You really thought something would be in here? Maybe a few teenagers taking advantage of the privacy, but otherwise?" He shrugged as if that were obvious. "When was the last time this was stocked?" he demanded. The old man stepped away from the blade, pointed at his throat, completely unruffled, and peered into the open doors. "Probably at least 10 years since Thorne put out the call to stock it." 10 years? Now, down in the South, they were more vigilant about it, at least back when General Karna was still in charge. "But it's supposed to be stocked for times of emergency. There's supposed to be enough for a season. Where are the people getting their food?" The man made his way to a shelf and wiped a finger through the thick dust. "That's a good question, Lieutenant. You should find out." "What do you know, old man?" "Director," he said calmly. "Most people called me Director since I held a position of some respect for many years." The lieutenant's shoulder twitched that someone else besides him may have been important, and then he remembered, belatedly, that he was supposed to be making friends with the citizenry. "This village, like so many others, has been raised in a culture of thievery," the director said, as if delivering a lecture. "You can thank the long-gone Garters for that. What they did in secret and in the dark, everyone now does brazenly in the open. There are plenty of ways to justify dishonesty in all of its manifestations." The lieutenant sighed impatiently. "I can tell you one thing, though. When Colonel Shin was in Edge, these storehouses were filled with grain and even dried fruits. I always felt secure in those days. I haven't for quite some time now. You need to find out why, Shin." The lieutenant stormed out angrily, not even noticing that the old man called him Shin instead of Thorne. He mounted his horse again and headed north to the other storehouse. Maybe that one was filled and supplying everyone. The director sighed as he watched the young officer ride away. That wasn't the right response. The colonel would always say, "What can I do for you, Hegek?" He flinched as he heard another shout from across the road. The lieutenant hadn't realized there was an altercation behind him, just a stone's throw away. Colonel Shin would have noticed, though. Hegek slipped further back into the empty storehouse and behind a supporting post to wait it out, as he frequently did. He was grateful that no one yet had raided this structure for wood to burn. But with the growing cold, people would be looking for easy fuel. The Gracina boys used to do the cheap menial labor of chopping wood, but since they were all gone, things were going to get more desperate. Hegek sighed as pottery was smashed on the road. The men rooting through his neighbor's house weren't finding what they were looking for. Mead, likely. The soldiers would show up late again. Perhaps Hegek's part of the village wasn't bribing them enough for protection. But what was there left to bribe with? At least the thieves wouldn't be pillaging his house again. Last week they found nothing aside from his collection of books and heaps of documents from his times with the administrators, which made for excellent kindling. Maybe the world had forgotten Shin's admonition to store up food for an emergency, but Hegek didn't. The shelves he had built purposely deep secured enough grain and preserves for nearly a year, fronted by stacks of textbooks. He'd slip a few of those bags out later to share with his neighbors, an older couple like himself who would have nothing left for their dinner tonight. Hegek waited until the violence quieted down and the weeping of his neighbors told him it was safe to come out, because the thieves had moved on, destroying everything in their path, as if somehow that would make everything right again. A few minutes later, the lieutenant threw open the doors of the northern storehouse and cried out in exasperation, "Nothing again!" He tried not to panic as he rode for the fort and to the large storehouses filled with grain for the soldiers. He needed some of it to win over the citizenry and eliminate the enemies, which until last night he didn't even know he had. Without a word to anyone, he strode past the soldier on guard and into the first storehouse. He sighed in relief that the shelves were full of bags, but paused when he remembered what Sergeant Onus suggested. He walked down a narrow aisle to the back of a row and examined a bag which was stamped with the word wheat. "Sir, can I offer assistance?" a voice called to him. The lieutenant turned to the sergeant. "I'm just checking the supply, soldier." The sergeant walked quickly over to him, waving a paper. "I have the numbers right here, sir." "I know what the numbers are, Sergeant," the lieutenant said, trying to control the agitation in his voice. He was the one who'd been compiling these numbers for many moons before the volcano erupted. "But I want to know what's actually out here. I'd been told the storehouses in the village were adequately stocked, but I just learned that's a gross inaccuracy. Now I want to check these bags." The sergeant blinked a little too rapidly. "As you can see, sir, the shelves are filled with bags. No problems here, I can assure you that." The lieutenant heard the almost desperate tone in his voice. Staring at the soldier, he reached out blindly and grabbed a bag at random. He squeezed it, and his gut sank. "This," he said coldly, "does not feel like wheat." He yanked the bag off the shelf and dropped it on the ground. The sergeant held his breath as the lieutenant pulled out his long knife and cut the top of the bag open. The lieutenant, furious at what he found, looked up in accusation at the soldier. "We have a serious problem here, Sergeant. It seems even the wheat has turned to ash," he bellowed. The sergeant had the good sense to let his mouth drop open in shock. Why, I'm stunned, sir. This is unbelievable, sir. I'll get my men on it as soon as possible. I'm sure it's just an odd bag or two." The lieutenant stood up to loom over the babbly sergeant. "An odd bag or two? I want every bag in this storehouse checked and verified that it actually contains wheat." "Is there a problem, Lieutenant Thorne?" another voice called. A wiry captain with light hair and a tanned face made his way down to them. "It's not every day someone comes to my storehouses and accuses my men of deceit." "Captain Varus, this bag is filled with ash," the lieutenant exclaimed. "Someone's purposely deceived our fort, sir. I'm not accusing any soldiers yet, but I just learned that the village storehouses are empty, and probably the only way anyone is still eating is by stealing it from us. We need to examine every bag in each storehouse to ensure that it is actually wheat or oats or corn. How widespread this is, I can't even begin to imagine." The captain folded his arms and looked steadily at the lieutenant. "I think you're blowing this out of proportion, Thorne. It may be only a bag or two slipped in here as a joke, but," he said, reading the rage on the lieutenant's face. He turned to a sergeant. "Go to the command tower and tell Major Croup we may have an inventory problem. Have him bring all the inventory sheets from the past few seasons, if he can find them." The lieutenant nodded in approval as the sergeant ran out of the storehouse. "Thank you, sir. We should begin checking every row, beginning here in the back. I'll get some soldiers." The captain stepped up to him. "I will get some soldiers. This is my storehouse, and not under your control. Understood?" The lieutenant swallowed, remembering he was supposed to be making friends among the soldiers, not alienating every last one of them. "Of course, sir. I didn't mean any disrespect. I just wanted to lend my assistance. What would you have me do?" The captain tipped his head to the doors. "Stand outside and count the bags as they come out." The last thing Major Leonard Croup wanted to hear was that there was another inventory problem. He sagged as the sergeant explained what Lieutenant Thorne had discovered. The fort's commander, Major Twig, a man in his late 30s who, because of his thinning hair and perpetually strained expression, seemed much older, clenched and unclenched his fists. When the sergeant finished, Twig said to Croup, "Get the sheets and get over there immediately." Croup jumped a little and began to search a crate on the floor. "Major Twig," he said as he thumbed through the pages, "wouldn't you rather go to the storehouses? Seems like a commander kind of issue to me." Twig narrowed his eyes. "Does Lieutenant Thorne still make you nervous, Croup?" No, he said unconvincingly. "Not at all. It's just—" He didn't know what else to say, but he still makes me nervous. He took the stack of inventory sheets and, hoping he might have changed his mind in the last 2 seconds, held them out for Major Twig. Twig shook his head. "I'll be down there in a while, Croup. You start getting a handle on what's going on." Croup sighed and slouched out the door. When he reached the first storehouse, he was stunned by the amount of soldiers and bags on the field. It wasn't hard to find the young lieutenant. He was slashing bag after bag and shaking his head. Captain Varus was keeping a tally on a scrap of paper. So far it was over 100 bags of nearly everything besides wheat. Croup's walk slowed as he approached the 2 younger officers. Lieutenant Thorne looked up at him as he neared. "Major Croup, there might not be a single bag of grain in this entire storehouse. It's all ash or dirt or sand. This was supposed to keep this fort fed throughout the rainy season, and now we have a major problem, Major." No, that can't be," Croup said, waving the pages. "I have records that all of this is grain. This isn't my fault." He looked at Captain Varus. "No, this is your fault, Varus. You're supposed to be making sure everything that comes in and goes out is what it really is." Varus marched over to Croup. "My fault? Who's ultimately in charge of inventory, Croup? Who's responsible for making sure the numbers are accurate? You." "Sirs," Lieutenant Thorne said, stepping up to them, "arguing isn't solving anything. What we need to do is find out how widespread the problem is, then contact General Thorne and tell him of our need for more food. We can still fix this, but we need to understand the problem, then discover who's been stealing from the fort so we can stop them. Major Croup, the inventory sheets?" Croup thrust the sheets into the lieutenant's hands, still staring hard at Varus. A few more soldiers jogged to the scene to help the 50 already there pulling out bags from the storehouse. Sergeant Onus broke away and approached the officers. He was considerably shorter than the three men glaring at each other, and they looked down at the stocky man as he stopped in their huddle. "Sirs," he said in a low voice, "your raised voices are alarming the men. May I suggest we keep this discussion to a more level tone before we incite panic?" He glanced around at the dozens of soldiers, regarding the officers with varying degrees of worry. Lieutenant Thorne nodded. "Agreed," he said quietly. "There's plenty of blame to spread around, I'm sure." Captain Varus scoffed. "Ha! I'm not about to take any. I've done my duty here, watched these soldiers man these doors. If someone's profiteering from the storehouse, it's not my fault." Croup stood to his full height, slightly taller than the captain. "Are you suggesting it's my fault? I'd like to know how you'd prove that. Show me how I'm profiting, I dare you." "Sirs," the lieutenant whispered sharply, "enough!" Varus rounded on him. "I'll tell you what I've had enough of, Mr. Thorne. You! How dare you interrupt a discussion between two officers with seniority? You've got your papers, so get to work." That silenced the lieutenant. Varus snatched the papers out of his hand. "Right here, little boy wonder. Start with these numbers and names right here. Supplier, stocker, verifier." He stopped suddenly as he stared at the sheets. "Verifier," he repeated slowly. He looked at Croup and then turned to the lieutenant with a small, nasty smile. "Sergeant Onus," he said, still eyeing the lieutenant, whose brows were knitting together, "would you verify something for me?" Varus handed Onus the stack. "Onus, would you tell me whose name is signed at the bottom of these forms?" Onus took the forms and shifted nervously as he looked at one, then another below it, then several more below. Yes, this is accurate. I witness the signings myself every week." Varus, still staring at the lieutenant with his ugly smile, said, "That's what I thought. So, what have you been up to, Lieutenant Thorne?" The lieutenant felt sick. "What are you talking about?" "I realize your name recently changed," Varus said in an oily tone. "But Onus here can attest that the signatures verifying that the storehouses have the correct amounts in them belongs to someone formerly known as Corporal Shin." The lieutenant took a hard step back. "What? Are you suggesting these bags of dirt are my fault? How can that be?" His former sergeant cleared his throat. Lieutenant, by signing these forms, you were stating that Major Croup's inventory numbers coincided with what was on the shelves in the storehouses. You did do a physical count a few times, right?" The lieutenant could only splutter. "Well, I... Varus stepped closer. "Did you actually verify what was in those bags you counted? Or did you do what I've been doing, assuming that the word painted on the bag is what's actually in it?" Dumbfounded and nauseated, the lieutenant couldn't respond. "The last signature on the form is the verifying one," Varus leered, "and is ultimately responsible for what's in the storehouses." The lieutenant could hardly breathe. He looked to Onus for help. Onus shrugged. "That's true, Lieutenant." He put a bracing hand on his shoulder. "Is there anything you'd like to confess to us? Just to get it off your chest? After all, we need to find out." "No!" The lieutenant found his voice. "I didn't do anything wrong. The verifying signature? I was just doing a favor to the major, trying to get his numbers in order so that the general wouldn't be angry at him for messing up the inventories." Croup flushed red in embarrassment and fury. "His should have been the verifying signature," he pointed at Croup. "All I verified were that the numbers added up correctly. No one ever told me the bag should have been opened and inspected. I was only a first-year soldier." Varys nodded officiously to Croup, and the major waved over two soldiers. "Sergeants, please escort Lieutenant Thorne to the command tower," Croup said in his best imitation of an officer in charge. "Get some assistance if you need it." The lieutenant stammered in shock. "Well, I'm under arrest for what?" Croup shook his head. "Certainly not under arrest, Lieutenant. We just need to discuss a few matters in private." Onus took the lieutenant's arm. "Just go with them, quietly," he whispered. "We'll get this straightened out, I'm sure. Let everyone cool down a bit. Have a chat with Major Twig, and then we can get to solving this problem, all right?" The lieutenant nodded helplessly at his former sergeant and looked to the command tower. The soldiers on either side of him started walking, each keeping a hand on the lieutenant's elbows. Croup looked back at Varys, who gave him a brief nod. "Captain, let me know the final tally as soon as you have it, all right?" "Of course," Varys said. "I'll have Onus bring it to you." "Very good." Croup followed a few paces behind the lieutenant and his escorts. Varys turned to the soldiers, who had all paused in their work to take in the entertainment. "Keep moving bags, men," he ordered. "We have 4 more storehouses to check." The soldiers went back to their task as Onus turned to Varys. The sergeant barely moved his lips. "Fantastically done." "You're welcome," the captain breathed back. Sure that no one was listening, he murmured, "Incidentally, I didn't get my share of the last profits yet." "All suspicion is now focused on one person. Isn't that enough?" Onus said quietly. "You were nervous we'd be detected, but now you've got nothing to be nervous about. Soon the crisis will be fully appreciated, the finger of blame pointed at the soldier we need to eliminate, the general will be desperate for supplies, and then we can give him the good news that we've just heard about a land to the north bursting with food." Varys snickered quietly. "You were on your way to wealth earlier," Onus reminded him. "But in the past 8 weeks, we've become the wealthiest men in the world after Thorne, even with the payouts to the soldiers for their silence. What more could you want? Besides, I did all the work today." Varys scoffed good-naturedly. "Oh, so you've been overseeing the loading of the bags of ash, stacking them on the shelves, and getting the real grain to the highest bidders?" Onus glanced at him. "You wouldn't have been able to accomplish any of that without my telling you a week in advance what supplies to expect. Remember, we're a good partnership. Always have been. Maybe someday we should thank the little lieutenant for his help," he said with feigned affection. "It's all been thanks to him that we've had all the numbers, and I'm sure you remember that I'm the one who set up the entire Colonel Shin help me with the numbers situation to begin with, correct?" Varys glanced back with a smile. "All right, Onus, you earned the share for today," he muttered. "Just keep me informed." He turned to another row of soldiers who were shouting in excitement. "What? Is it finally a bag of corn?" he called as many soldiers cheered. "Excellent. The news just keeps getting better, men." Major Twig's glare wasn't quite enough to penetrate the thick skull of the lieutenant. He watched Thorne's son squirm in his chair, readjust his position, and bounce his leg anxiously. Twig hadn't been aware that tending the general's son would also be part of his new duties. But he'd never questioned the orders of General Thorne. He'd just have to deal with this little Zenus upstart while keeping the general's pride upheld. That's how he could remain valuable to the most powerful man in the world. The lieutenant leaned forward. "Sir, please." The major held up his hand. "As I've told you twice, we're waiting on Professor Slither. Until your appointed guardian arrives, we discuss nothing." Croup took a wagon to retrieve him. The lieutenant scoffed. "Oh, what do I need a guardian for?" The major raised his eyebrows. "Oh, I can think of a few reasons. One is that you're under suspicion for sabotaging the entire stability of the fort and the village of Edge through profiteering. If people starve to death, it just might be your fault." "I was under Onus's command at the time. Please, sir, Onus knows all about me. Why would I have done this? It doesn't add up. Where are my profits? Why would I expose myself?" "Makes you look innocent, doesn't it, Lieutenant?" Twigg said coldly. "Discovering the crime before anyone else does?" The lieutenant rolled his eyes in exasperation. "Oh, sir, Onus can help straighten all of this out. Professor Slither, he knows nothing. What can he do?" He cringed when he recognized the wheezing coming up the command tower stairs. "What can I do?" called the strained voice. "First, I cannot have a heart attack by the time I reach the top. Who designed this ridiculous building anyway?" Slither took a deep breath as he reached the top of the stairs and shambled into the office, leaning on the arm of Major Croup, who did his best to not look at the lieutenant. "Twigg," Slither said as the major stood up and shook his hand. "I failed you in something, didn't I?" Twigg smiled obligingly. "Not me, Professor. I was one of your best students before Sargon took over Idemia. You must be thinking of one of your other southern students." Croup cleared his throat. "Major Twigg, I'd like to get back to the storehouses. I want to see just how deeply in trouble we are." "I can handle things here, Leonard. Go ahead." As Croup jogged back down the stairs, Slither sat down heavily in a chair and pointed at the major. "Give me time. I'll remember what course you failed. Now, what has this one failed?" he said, jabbing a thumb toward the lieutenant. The lieutenant rolled his eyes again like a 14-year-old. "The only thing I'm guilty of is trying to make Croup look good." "Hey!" Major Twigg shouted at him. "You will speak only when addressed, Lieutenant. Is that understood? Professor, first thing you best teach this little upstart is the proper respect for his superiors." "Indeed," Slither intoned. "There's a great deal this boy needs to learn. I think he's been given far too much freedom merely because of his new name. He needs some reining in. I think his father is overconfident about his abilities." "I can see why he sent you here, Professor," Twigg nodded. "He's been known to violate the rules." The lieutenant couldn't sit quietly anymore. "Sirs, please, if I may defend myself—" "Were we speaking to you?" the major roared. The lieutenant blinked in surprise and shook his head. In a calmer tone, Twigg turned back to Slither. "As I was saying, the lieutenant here has a record of rule-breaking. He abandoned his 20 to join the battle before his first year of duty was completed. He lied to several officers about his name, his rank, his home fort, and his age. He was recently seen visiting the house of Miss Amory." It wasn't as if the lieutenant said anything, but his loud scoff and waving in protest was enough to make Twigg point angrily at him. He fell back helplessly into his chair, and Twigg picked up again. "Miss Amory, it seems, has developed a new business to keep herself supplied during this crisis. Soldiers are being sent to inspect her residence for anything suspicious. Now, while the general has been gracious enough to not allow the previous serious offenses cloud the lieutenant's record, nor, I am sure, would he be pleased to hear about these new developments, Leckthorn's behavior does show a pattern of disrespect for all rules, as well as flagrant disregard for behavior becoming an officer, especially for the son of General Lemuel Thorne." Slither nodded. "Agreed." "Therefore," the major continued, ignoring the lieutenant's open-mouthed protests, "I recommend that the lieutenant remain confined to the mansion until this situation is resolved. Once the guilty parties are identified, we can then decide what should be done in regard to the lieutenant here. By no means should he become an embarrassment to General Thorne. The lieutenant sank in stunned silence. Again, agreed, Slither said. If the lieutenant is in the mansion all day and all night, we can get through his coursework 3 times as quickly. You can trust him to my care, Twig. Perhaps a few more guards stationed around the mansion just to be sure of everyone's security would be prudent. Wouldn't want anything to happen to the general's son now, would we? Excellent idea, Twig said. I'll get right on it. In the meantime, Lieutenant, you may help the professor down the stairs. Sir, in my defense, may I please? The major looked at him sharply. If it comes to a trial, then yes, you may make your own defense. But for now, I've heard enough about and from you. Dismissed. It felt wrong to be in the study after midday meal, but the lieutenant knew there was no point in begging to go to the fort to find out the status of the grain reserves. Instead, he went over his 8th draft of his letter to the general. A messenger had been called for to take a letter from Slither to General Thorne about the situation, but the lieutenant wasn't about to let others speak for him. His letter explained his searching the storehouses, his discovery, his innocence, his desire to serve the general, the need for more food to be sent north, and his suggestion that he join the general in Idemia as soon as possible. He even signed it, Your son Lek, for good measure, although he stopped short of addressing it to Father. He tried to do that a few drafts before, but it looked so grotesque on the parchment that he tossed those pages into the fireplace to be burned. He heard a knock at the door, leaped to his feet, and ran to the front doors as the guard opened it. Messenger to Idemia has arrived, the guard announced. Good, wheezed Slither from his bedroom. I'm finished. Sir, I'll get that, the lieutenant called as he walked to his room. I can bring your message to the door for you. Slither squinted. Will it reach the messenger if I hand it to you? The lieutenant forced a smile. Sir, I have nothing to hide, and I'm sure the general will recognize that. Let me help you seal that, sir, he said, taking the several pages from Slither and wondering what the shaky writing might reveal. He slipped his folded message into the middle of the stack, put it in an envelope, and closed it with the wax and seal of the mansion. If it makes you feel better, you can accompany me to the door just to see. Slither put a fat foot up on a stool. I suppose I can trust you as far as the front door, but you come back immediately. Of course, sir, the lieutenant promised as he walked the envelope out and handed it to the messenger. To Idemia, straight away. But the messenger shook his head. I'm to return to the command tower and wait for the final tallies from the storehouses to be reported to General Thorne. Those numbers should be ready soon. The lieutenant swallowed. Just how bad is it? I want to know, too, shouted Slither from his bedroom. The messenger stepped into the entry and called back to the professor. Nearly half of the first storehouse is dirt. Half of the second and 1/3 of 2 more are also packed with only ash or dirt. Seems the thieves have been removing planking from the back of the buildings, taking the grain, then replacing them with bags of dirt. The messenger shot an accusatory look at the lieutenant. Clever, clever, Slither called back. So, how long until the grain runs out? Those are the numbers they're working on, sir. I'll have someone notify you as soon as it's known. The lieutenant felt the need to prove his innocence. Yes, please do. We're both anxious to see how we can help. The messenger regarded him dubiously, slipped the message into his inner jacket pocket, and marched out of the mansion. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.